Hannah Beswick was a wealthy and somewhat eccentric woman who had a terrible fear of being buried alive. As such, she instructed her doctor not to bury her after she passed, and to comply with her wishes, he decided to mummify Beswick, and her mummified corpse would be on display for the next 100 years. Join me as we explore her story. The strange story of the Manchester mummy doesn't start with a ruler of ancient Egypt as you might think, nor does it involve an Egyptologist, the name for archaeologists and historians of ancient Egypt. Instead, it starts with Hannah Beswick, a well-off but otherwise unremarkable woman from Manchester. Hannah was born in 1688 at Cheatwood in Oldhall, on the outskirts of Manchester. At this time the northern city was little more than a sleepy town, as the Industrial Revolution that would transform it was still nearly a century away. Her parents were John Beswick and Patience Beswick. They were a wealthy business family at a time when the cloth industry was already considerable in the greater Yorkshire and Lancashire region. Thus, when her father died in 1706, when Hannah was entering her late teens, she inherited a substantial fortune from him. This amounted to thousands of pounds, millions in today's money. With it, she purchased the manor of Bircham Bower at Hollingwood, near Oldham, a suburb of Manchester today, though an entirely separate town at the time. Here she lived out a somewhat unremarkable life, until her death in February 1758, when she was probably 69 years of age. Yet, she was something of an eccentric, burying much of her fortune in 1745, when the Jacobite rebellion in Scotland that year threatened to expand into northern England, and did for a time. She apparently never retrieved the buried money, and never told her relatives where it was, leading to treasure hunts around Bircham Bower in modern times. By now you might be asking, where does the mummy come into all of this? Well, it all relates to the phenomenon of live or premature burials that happened in early modern Europe, and a strange incident involving Hannah Beswick's brother, which had a lasting impact on her psychology. To better understand Hannah Beswick's story, we first need to look at premature burials, which were not all that uncommon at the time. A premature burial is where an individual is buried in a coffin as part of a Christian burial, only for he or she to wake up alive underground. This could happen for a number of reasons. Sometimes, people fell into a coma and woke up buried alive in a coffin as their loved ones were convinced they were dead. Other times, rare illnesses such as lock-in syndrome could make a person appear to be deceased, and so a funeral and burial took place. More commonly, it was maybe people entering into a completely catatonic state that may have convinced others that they had passed. Whatever the cause might have been, the problem in early modern times was that a lack of medicinal and scientific knowledge often led to a premature diagnosis that someone was dead. Especially in rural areas, there were usually very few people capable of making any sort of informed decision on whether a person was dead or not. Even a procedure like checking for a pulse, one which seems so simple we take it for granted today, might not have been engaged in hundreds of years ago. Unsurprisingly, many people ended up in a coffin while they were still alive. The numbers have been fairly widely debated and can't be determined with any precision, but scholars of the subject believe that thousands were buried alive across Europe every year in early modern times. The physician J. Stenson Hooker estimated the figure to be around 800 annually in England and Wales alone. As was to be expected, some people were very concerned that this might happen to them. Hannah Beswick was one such individual, and she went to extreme lengths to make sure she didn't fall prey to such a fate. Hannah Beswick's path to becoming the Manchester mummy began with the funeral of her brother James one day in the early 1750s. The exact date is unfortunately unrecorded. James's funeral began much like any other, with people attending a Christian religious ceremony, followed by the transit of his body to the graveyard. As James's corpse was about to be sealed up and lowered into the ground, one of the mourners noticed something unusual. James, it seemed, was blinking. The person quickly let this be known, and a further examination of his corpse by Dr. Charles White, a young doctor at the time, revealed that James Beswick was alive after all. The mourners took his coffin back to his house, where he regained full consciousness a few days later from whatever was ailing him. James's close brush with being buried alive had an immense impact on his sister Hannah Beswick. We could say that she now developed taphophobia, the fear of being buried alive. But whether we can call it taphophobia in this instance is, of course, open to debate. A phobia is generally something which contains an element of irrationality to it. However, having seen her brother very nearly buried alive a few years earlier, Mrs. Beswick's fear that the same thing might happen to her was entirely justified. In any event, it would soon lead to an extraordinary development. Hannah Beswick died just a few years after the near-life burial of her brother. It was soon revealed that she had gone to great lengths to ensure that she would not be buried alive herself. In July 1857, she had amended her will to bequeath £100 to Dr. Charles White, the same doctor who had declared her brother to in fact be alive at his graveside a few years earlier. With this, the doctor was to ensure that once she died, Hannah's body was not to be buried, instead being kept around above ground indefinitely, where he was to perform regular checks to ensure she had not mistakenly been identified as having passed away. There were ways, of course, of dealing with taphophobia. Such was the fear of being buried alive in late medieval and early modern times that several devices had been employed to prevent it ever happening. One such measure was a safety coffin. This is a coffin fitted with a mechanism to prevent premature burial. One type of safety coffin included a lever that could open the coffin from the inside. This was all fine and well, so long as the coffin was not yet underground. But it is hard to see how this would work if there was 6 feet of mud on top of the coffin, weighing down the lid. Several other devices like a ringing bell could also be employed, but White elected for an altogether different method after Beswick died in 1758. Hannah Beswick's taphophobia only partially explains how the Manchester mummy came about. The other part of the explanation lies in the rather eccentric decisions of Dr. Charles White. He could have chosen a wide range of methods to preserve Hannah's body in order to fulfill her last wishes, but from amongst them he chose the unusual method of mummification. There was seemingly no reference in Beswick's will that she wanted to be embalmed, yet White went ahead and did this anyway. After waiting for a sufficiently long time to ensure that she was in fact dead, White decided to double down on her request not to be buried. Turpentine and vermilion were injected into the corpse's arteries and veins, the organs were removed, and as much blood as possible was extracted from the body. After being washed in spirits, the organs were then reinserted and the cavities of the body were packed with substances like resin and camphor. Finally, the body was anointed with oils and placed into a sarcophagus filled with plaster of Paris. Hence was born the Manchester mummy. Why White did this is not entirely clear, though it was largely tied into a legal dispute surrounding Hannah's will. In order to receive the £100 that was bequeathed to him, a considerable sum of money at the time, White believed he would have to prove that he had preserved her body in some way without burying it, as per her instructions. He may also have been inspired by a scientific desire to understand how mummification worked, and by then he was a pioneer in the fields of surgery, obstetrics, and orthopedics. There was now the tricky matter of where the Manchester mummy was to be stored. For a time, her embalmed body was kept at Ancoats Hall, a large manor owned by another member of the family. But her relatives soon became uneasy with having the macabre remains of Hannah in their home, and the mummy was returned to White after a short period. Thereafter, for seemingly the rest of his life, down to 1813, some 55 years after Hannah died, White kept the Manchester mummy on display in an old large freestanding clock case. The curiosity soon attracted attention, and over the decades many people paid a small fee to visit White's house and C. The Manchester Mummy. When White died in 1813, the Manchester Mummy was inherited by a colleague of his, a Dr. Ollier, who had possession of it for the next 15 years until he himself died in 1828. Then it was given to the Museum of the Manchester Natural History Society. It was at this juncture that Beswick's emballed remains became known as the Manchester Mummy. In an age of scientific curiosity, and when world fairs and expositions were all the rage, the museum capitalized on their strange display, and Beswick's mummy became quite a sensation in the mid-19th century. The odyssey of Hannah Beswick's remains would finally come to an end in 1868, 110 years after her death. The previous year, the Museum of the Manchester Natural History Society was subsumed into the New Manchester Museum. As its collections were being transferred and recategorized, the Manchester Mummy became something of a controversial issue, as some religious figures and politicians began arguing it was unacceptable that the remains of an 18th century woman who had not been given a proper Christian burial should be on public display in this fashion. A legal case followed, in which it was concluded that Hannah Beswick was certainly legally dead at this point, and so her desire to not be buried in the off chance she might still be alive need no longer be complied with. Thus, on the 22nd of July 1868, Hannah Beswick was buried in Arbor Hay Cemetery in Manchester. She was almost certainly not alive when she was buried. In the years after her death and before her burial, her home Birchen Bower was converted into apartments, and several of the residents claimed to have seen a figure dressed in a black silk gown and a white cap, and described it as Hannah Beswick. It would glide across her former estate and vanish at one particular flagstone. Birchen Bower was eventually demolished to make way for a factory, but sightings of her alleged ghost were still reported. With the advent of modern science and medicine, the phenomenon of premature or live burial declined considerably in the late 19th century, and all but disappeared in the 20th. There was a greater awareness of how people could fall temporarily into comas or suffer from illnesses, which might leave them appearing as though they were actually dead for days or even weeks at a time. Most importantly, doctors were trained to check people's vital signs to see if they were actually dead before the process of burying somebody began. That said, premature burials are still not unheard of. In 2013, a video emerged of a man being pulled alive from his own grave in Brazil after he had mistakenly been thought to be dead. Such instances are rare though. Instead, premature burials and taphophobia have become something which is more a feature of horror movies like 1962's The Premature Burial and 1990's Buried Alive. It even featured in the second part of Quentin Tarantino's Kill Bill films. These attest to the fear that being buried alive can still provoke in an age when it very rarely occurs anymore. Just imagine how frightening it must have been when hundreds or thousands of people were buried alive every year, and we come some way to understanding how the strange story of the Manchester Mummy came about in the first place. Thank you so much everyone for watching this video on Hannah Beswick and the Manchester Mummy. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know what you thought of her life down below in the comments, and if you have any suggestions, also be sure to leave them down below in the comments. I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.